Okay, guys, let's jump right in as folks are joining. Appreciate you uh, joining with us as well as we cover some key things about duty drawback and what you need to know. Tim, really appreciate you being willing to be part of this as well. I know you have a lot of experience with drawback, both with some of the largest providers of drawback in the US and then you moved over to Flexport to start the drawback program there. And did I hear you right that you've been working on drawback since high school?
Yeah, I was doing data entry at a drawback provider while I was in high school and in college, and that's kind of how I got into it. Yeah,
Man, well, you found your calling early. That's you're fortunate. What a time to be in it too. And on my
absolutely.
side, Tom Taggart head up the global trade team here at Passport. So the key today is really to give you some background about drawback, but really focus on things that are not as obvious, things that Tim and I have seen come up with merchants and with their 3PLs to support them. And how do you give you enough information to have a really meaningful conversation with your drawback provider? Merchant asked recently if they could just do this themselves, if they could just submit the drawback application and the claims. And I thought, I don't see how. I think it would be essential to go through a drawback provider. So giving you some details here that would make that conversation with them much more valuable and to help you evaluate which provider you end up going with. And of course, Q&A. This is for y'all. So please throw your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar, and we will definitely leave time for that. But just to level set what drawback is and what it's not, this is a very specific codified US program that's been around since 1789, allows you to recover up to 99% of duties and fees on goods that primarily have been imported into the US and then exported. We'll go through some of the different variations and the programs within that. But we also want to distinguish that from what many people call drawback. And sometimes what they're talking about is simply just a tax refund on a returned item from another market. And that's not really what this is. This is a very specific program for CBP, for US Customs. And you probably hear some similar things where drawback can get conflated with other programs.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'll say, it's really designed to be an export program. People think about imports and the tariffs, right? And that's where you're paying them, right? But on the outbound side, if you're exporting or you're destroying, that's what qualifies a drawback opportunity. And so I hear a lot, hey, I misclassified this, or the broker used the wrong value, or they applied the wrong, tariff, right? The wrong
Mm.
IEPA or 232, and I need to get this corrected, and I want my drawback. And it's like, no, that's not a drawback. There are mechanisms through PSCs, recons, where potentially there are refunds, but this program in particular is if you're importing, you're paying duties. If you're exporting or destroying, drawback is the mechanism to get that money back.
Yeah, not a post summary correction, not a one-off recovery of duties on a return, a very specific program that has a lot of detail to it and often overlooked. The
Mhm.
past numbers have had this figure at about 7 billion unclaimed every year. I think in 2025 that is going to be exponentially higher.
Yeah.
And we want to give you enough information to make the decision if you want to pursue drawback. I really think everyone should put in for drawback privileges. You may feel the same, Tim.
I do. Yes.
Yeah. So let's get into what's eligible. A lot of new tariffs this year. The standard general tariff, whatever your HS code is, your commodity classification, and your country of origin, tells you what your standard duty rate is, and that's recoverable. Section 301 tariffs really cranked up in 2018 with the first Trump administration. Maybe paying 25% on your goods from China in addition to your general tariffs. These are all stacking. And then you have the 2025 IEPA reciprocal tariffs, varies by country, 10% addition for anything made in China or Hong Kong. Merchandise processing fee, of course, for formal entries. That can really add up. You have a minimum that you pay per entry, and then it caps out. Now it's at 651. And then you have anything that's imported by ocean. You'll see a harbor maintenance fee that can also add up as well. So when you look at all this, it really is a lot of money that can be on the table, and especially when you're getting 99% of that back. What's not eligible, new to this year as well, are the what's often called the fentanyl tariffs. It started in February as 10% on goods from China, all goods from China, moved to 20% in March, and then next week it's actually getting reduced back to 10%. So the good news there is it's going to be less of an impact. Bad news is it's not eligible for drawback. This was specifically carved out and prohibited from drawback. I don't think many merchants are going to see anti-dumping, countervailing duties, AD/CVD, but just to be aware of it, it is excluded. And we'll dig into this in more detail. But one thing that often gets merchants hung up is on returns. And if they're not handled properly, they're no longer considered unused merchandise, and that can be a concern for merchants.
Yeah, I'd also add that, Section 232 largely is ineligible for drawback. Also, probably not something that this audience is necessarily going to see a lot of. There's the latest 232s, which are eligible for either certain types of drawback or for drawback altogether, but largely the large sum of it is ineligible.
Yeah.
And over quota agricultural duties. Again, not something that this audience is necessarily going to see.
Yeah, good points. We are going to look at the three provisions we see most often for e-commerce merchants. And the most prevalent, of course, is the unused merchandise. And Tim, I think your tagline on your email says it: import, export, drawback. That's you're importing finished goods, you're exporting them in the same condition. That's what's eligible for drawback.
Yeah.
Rejected merchandise is more complex, and we'll spend a little time on this, but many e-commerce merchants do have returns, domestic returns, international returns, especially if you're in apparel and footwear. That can be a significant portion. It can be a meaningful amount that is actually being exported and returned, or sold domestically and returned. And can you walk us through how that works if goods are put back into inventory as the same item and then resold if they are returned even domestically?
Yeah, this is a massive point of contention for any company doing e-commerce, in particular consumer apparel products. So essentially, let's say I order this shirt from you, and maybe I order a medium and a large, and medium doesn't quite fit me and the large fits me right. Me trying it on as the end consumer, that is considered use from customs perspective, because the intended use of this shirt is for it to be worn. So once that item is worn and sent back through visual inspection or otherwise, it may seem first quality, but from customs perspective, that is a used item. Now, if that item is returned back into the physical inventory from which export orders or drawback, or the inventory in which you intend to claim drawback, it does present qualification issues as it relates to unused merchandise in particular. And if you are accepting that item and commingling it, meaning now losing traceability, upon exportation, unless you can tell me which order it came in on, that particular unit, it also doesn't qualify for rejected merchandise returns from retail. So it is something that retail returns, a statute designed for the realities of e-commerce, as customs puts it, has in many cases nullified opportunities for apparel and e-commerce brands. So it's something significant that we need to watch out for.
See, what do you often tell merchants about that, or their fulfillment partners? What's the best practice to manage returns so that you're not tainting the drawback pool?
Yeah. The obvious one is don't accept returns. I'm joking. I know that's not a reality for most. Sorry, I should have given you a heads up. I was going to make that joke, but the reality is, companies have to be able to accept returns. If you want access to markets, you often have to be able to take returns. Otherwise, customers don't feel comfortable making, or purchasing products from companies. So, what can you do? There are some ways. So what customs is really looking for, how do you ensure that any item that is being exported is unused? And so they're looking for physical and a systemic or electronic segregation of that inventory. So physical being, keep it in one particular pick pack location, one storage bin, keep your returns completely separate, and only use that location for domestic fulfillment. Another avenue that many companies are doing is, there's already a QA process for when merchandise comes in. Add one step, put a red sticker on the tag, put something that identifies it. If you're putting it from one poly bag to another, and there is a distinction between the two different poly bags, note what that distinction is. And if your SOP, when you're filling orders, watch out for the red stickers. If it's an export outside of North America, don't pick the red sticker, pick something else. Don't pick the secondary poly bag, pick something that has not been used. So there needs to be some type of way to do that. There, outside of not accepting returns or keeping them completely in separate locations, the sticker system or visual identification of the difference between them and having a process for that has been accepted. There are, you have to phrase things very properly with customs, which is why, going the broker route is highly suggested. But those are very common avenues. Other possible outcomes or solutions might be, if you have physical retail locations as well, send the returns to a physical store instead of the fulfillment center. That could be another way to mitigate the impact here.
Love it. What about electronically? Can they just give it a different SKU number for something that's been returned?
Yeah, we see it's not very common, but having a prefix or suffix to the SKU to identify it. If you have RFIDs, potentially having the ability to notate the original order so that, and then be able to track that through fulfillment and identify it at the time of sale. There are ways to do that. If you have specific pick pack locations where you process returns, having the ability to electronically identify which pick pack location that order is coming from. And if it's a return bin and it's being exported out, we just know, all right, this is ineligible, but all these other locations are.
Gotcha. All right. Let's talk about manufacturing. Imagine you must see this with cosmetics and nutritional supplements brands. They're importing raw materials, chemicals, ingredients, packaging, tubing, formulating the product in the US, packaging it up as something that's very different from all the imported components, and then exporting it as a finished product.
Yeah.
How does that work with manufacturing drawback?
Absolutely. So manufacturing is honestly where me as a drawback practitioner, I love manufacturing. I think manufacturing is a whole lot of fun because that's where you really understand, the business that a company is doing. So when you import raw materials, there's different types of raw materials, right? Well, there's packaging materials like lipstick containers and bottles and caps and lids and labels. And those are not, you can make the argument that they are part of the manufacturing process. They're made into a new and different article. However, they still contain their own original characteristics. So there is a provision in 19 USC 1313, which is the drawback statute under Q, for packaging. So you brought up cosmetics, and that's where this is extremely popular. Is you bring in the cosmetic containers, whatever the case may be. And that's an unused operation when you fill them. When you have the lipstick or whatever shampoos that you're producing within the US, and you're really converting the product from one thing to the next, that is on manufacturing. So oftentimes we see packaging components lumped into a manufacturing operation. So it is I think more common that it is rolled into manufacturing than it is split out, but there is a separate provision for packaging materials. But essentially, right, you import these components. You then have a BOM, a bill of materials, which identifies the components that are used to produce X quantity of finished good. Usually it's one finished good. Let's call it a lipstick, right? You have all these components that are used to produce one lipstick, and then I have an export of that one lipstick. So the way that manufacturing works is you take the export, you deconstruct the BOM, and then you find imports that match. Under substitution, which is most common for manufacturing, because if you're doing direct identification, you're kind of hamstringing yourself. There's no benefit really outside of if you don't have units to measure, if you don't have standard cost, maybe it does make sense to do that. But you match up HTS to HTS from component to import. And I know we'll get into that a little bit on the next slide, but that's sort of the process for how it works. For manufacturing substitution as well, you don't need to document the use of any import. You just need to show that this finished good was produced using that classified component and that it was exported and all those things. So manufacturing is a lot of fun, but you have to go through a ruling process, and I know we'll dive into that as well. So there's a couple extra steps than the unused or the rejected would go through.
Yeah, that's great, and that does get to the heart of why drawback exists. You want to encourage exports, and I know merchants right now are really feeling the pain on cash flow for importing components and manufacturing them into a finished product. So, good way to recover some of the duties and fees that you paid on the imported item that was then turned into another product and exported. All right, unused merchandise. I think that's what we're going to come across most often with e-com merchants. And substitution has to be your favorite, a little easier than direct identification, right?
Absolutely.
Well, tell me about that. You just have to match. Yep. Instead of having a SKU that has to match the style, size, and color, like a cashmere turtleneck, men's large,
right?
Just has to match the import and the export at the HTS US 8 level.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is very common now. I mean, it used to be where you would substitute based on SKU number, right? The commercial interchangeability concept was the old way of doing things, right? How do you demonstrate to customs that this SKU is identical to that SKU on the import and export side? And we had to submit applications for every single one of those, for those of you who've been doing this for a while. So we got rid of that, and substitution elevated to HTS level. The caveat here is it's not allowed. I mean, there's some carve outs for like orange juice and some sugar products and furniture moving pads, but it's not allowed on exports to Canada, Mexico, and Chile. However, if you're exporting outside of North America, you can match at the 8 or 10-digit level of the HTS. What I mean by that, or how do you differentiate between 8 or 10, it has to do with the description within the HTS number. So what customs didn't want companies to do was, in their eyes, not saying from my side, but in their eyes, they felt, the other that we see in the HTS is their words, lazy way of classifying, maybe not the most accurate. So they wanted to help to push companies to more accurately classify the merchandise, or if it meets certain criteria, you could actually petition the USITC through a 484F petition to create a more specific and articulate statistical suffix breakout, so that they would get more reporting, but at the very least, you have a very specific slot where merchandise should be classified. So if it is an other at the 8-digit, and if you look for anybody who's a licensed customs broker, you probably had your tariff schedule on a ruler. If you put that ruler down, you look straight across. If that starts with the word other, you have to look at the 10 digits. But if that also begins with the word other, then that is ineligible. But if it does not begin, anything within that 10-digit is eligible for claiming across it. But going back to if a first 8-digit does not begin with the word other, we see this a lot with footwear and apparel. But footwear is a very easy example because you have men, women's, and children's, or men, women, and other, right? You can import a men's shoe. Let's call it a blue size 10 men's shoe. Export a red size 8 women's shoe, and you can claim drawback on those. You can match across them. This presents a lot of opportunities. So we see this a lot where companies are importing from multiple country of origins. And it's all under, this particular HTS number, or there's certain product lines that fit into different places within the tariff schedule. And you're able to cross claim regardless of country of origin of what's gone and exported out against anything that was imported under that 8-digit HTS number, which created a lot of really valuable opportunities for companies to maximize their recoveries. Now, think as well, if you're domestically sourcing anything, if you're domestically sourcing and exporting out, if you have that classification, you import something, you can claim on your own imports. There's other ways through third parties, right, where you can work on, pulling together the information from the importer that you've sourced from. But that's probably something we'll talk about later, or if there are any questions about it, we can dive into it there.
Yeah, love it. So multiple countries of origin, you can schedule this in a way that you're claiming the highest duty rates on those exports.
Absolutely, a lot of flexibility.
Nice. But then you have Canada that's excluded, and probably one of the largest markets for US e-commerce brands. And you're pushed over to direct identification. And
Right.
within unused merchandise, there are two provisions, right? You have direct ID and substitution. We're going to talk about both of those, but direct ID, I think, is more challenging because where this was created for manufacturing and things that had serial numbers on them, you're not often going to find that in apparel and footwear. So how do you approach that, finding a unique identifier, a way to match up SKUs to say that this is the thing that was imported and match it into the export?
Yeah, it definitely is a challenge, especially at the bulk or volume that a lot of companies are importing under. But there are some ways that companies have done it. They carry forward like the carton number. I've seen that. I've seen a PO being carried through import through export. I also seen like a little, jerry rig of, vendor plus PO plus, some other identifiers to help carry through and identify the merchandise. I think if companies are, FDA regulated or regulated by another government agency, they might have some of this traceability. But with apparel, it's kind of hard, especially when you're looking at SKUs. If you have a barcode, you probably don't have a lot of context behind the transactions that they came on. So another alternative is some of the more complicated tracking that other technologies enable.
Yeah, love it. So you may have a lot number if it's something that would be regulated. You need to trace that back, so that could be a path, right, for direct ID. But then if you don't have that, another direct identification method is to use an accounting method. And let's talk about that and how this is really important for brands and their 3PLs to understand the accounting methods and where they come in.
Yeah, accounting methods are widely misunderstood. They're complicated because every company uses accounting methods or I'm not going to say every company, but most companies are using accounting methods for managing their inventories, managing any number of accounting functions. And what I'll say is the accounting method for drawback, in large part, is immaterial to the accounting methods that are being utilized by companies. It is in how you manage the data and what data is being pulled together that then is leveraged through basically the regulations defined very strictly on how the calculation must be done. So if you're doing a FIFO or a LIFO or some other accounting method within your inventory systems, your ERP systems, whatever the case may be, it is likely going to differ from that which is statutory for drawback or regulatory for drawback. And so what we typically are looking for is, you have to demonstrate the receipt of the merchandise into your inventory. Regardless of accounting method, you need to have all receipts into your inventory, whether it's imported, whether it's received domestically, if it's a return, whatever the case may be. If it's coming into your inventory, you have to track it. Then there's some ambiguity on what's necessary, not ambiguity, but there's some options as it relates to what you have to do on the outbound side. So there's first in, first out, last in, first out. Those are very common. Everybody knows what they are generally, right? But in order to do those properly, you have to have not just all of your receipts, you have to have all of your withdrawals, regardless of if it's exported, sold domestically, if you're scrapping or destroying, right? That could also be a drawback opportunity, or whatever the case may be if you're pulling it out of inventory. We have to account for those as all together. That's both for FIFO and LIFO, and technically there's a low to high that is allowed for that. But if you're pulling together all that data, what you don't want to do is use it in the most disadvantageous way, right? You're just going to be going to lowest duty per unit and providing all that data. You're better off going FIFO or LIFO. Then there's, you can carve out any of your domestic transactions and only worry about your exports, or only worry about your exports and destructions. And thereby you have the option then, to do the low to high blanket. This is the most common one that I'll say. If you have a drawback program today and you're doing low to high blanket, I would reevaluate, because the tariffs scene is extremely different than it used to be. If you like only providing export data, there's the next option that is highly recommended, or switching to a FIFO or a LIFO would be more advantageous to you. But the next one would be low to high with an average inventory. So low to high with an average inventory turnover. So it's going to take that same low to high blanket methodology, meaning lowest duty per unit or drawback per unit within your inventory over the last 5 years for the low to high blanket, to the lowest duty per drawback per unit within your average inventory turnover period, which, if it's like, let's call it 180 days, is, instead of 5 years, you're limiting that scope to 180 days. Within 180 days, as long as duty rates are fairly constant, values are fairly constant, going low to high is not, or low to high with average inventory is not necessarily going to cripple you tremendously. FIFO and LIFO are going to be the highest fidelity, and then you have some, going low to high, it just from a record and a documentation and data perspective is a little easier, but you're going to give some on the recovery.
Do you find most 3PLs are already set up for this, or are there additional steps that they're going to need to take, or any best practices you might recommend?
Yeah, I do think 3PLs are well set up for this. They track import, they track receiving very well. What they might not have is the link between what was declared to customs, right? The entry line in particular, to what was received. There might be a link with the broker. So if there is like a dedicated partnership between 3PL and broker, it might be worth having that conversation to see that they both use the same link to help bridge the gap. So I see more of the challenge being, I have all this import data from the broker, maybe in partnership with the 3PL, but typically from the broker. And now I have all this receiving data from the 3PL. I have to match it up. And right, if I have to account for everything, I want to know what portions of the 3PL data is related to imports versus domestic receipts that are non-dutiable. We can't claim them. On the outbound side, it's relatively straightforward. We know where stuff's going typically. The data is pretty reliable. We have a ship date, which, within reason approximates the export date. What we sometimes don't have are not necessarily, and what I'll say too on the export side, it's all records kept in normal course of business. So while it would be great to have a bill of lading or a tracking number, or if it's going to Canada, the B3 or the CAD number, if it's going to Mexico, the pedimento, that would be great and ideal. And eventually there is a future where that is likely to be a necessity. At this point, there is no requirement by customs for any one particular field. It has to be something on the documents, hopefully, or that's something that can be demonstrated, but there is no requirement. So 3PLs on the outbound side pretty much have good lock on the data. What I think a lot of 3PLs do very well, where some, companies who might be doing it themselves don't, is on the retention of the export data documents, right? The FedEx labels, the proof of delivery that it got to the end customer in Canada, right? That's where 3PLs seem to have a better handle on it because of their process. Maybe they're the ones that are actually shipping it. So that's, I think, one area where 3PLs certainly have the advantage.
Yeah. All right, really valuable. And your drawback provider is going to help you determine the right one and maximize your claim by going through what you have access to and what's going to be eligible for your situation. And I think in many cases you're applying for both, right? Direct identification and substitution drawback privileges, right?
In a lot of cases, we do try to apply for both.
Okay. Very good. Well, let's look at that process, because this is not instant gratification. You're not getting your money back in 30 days. This is a lengthy process. And to step through it, it starts with that application, right? A drawback is a privilege. You have to apply for drawback privileges and be issued those privileges before you can submit a claim. And that's where you're putting together this application fairly formulaic until you get to the matching and the traceability, right? Where you have to follow a SKU through the process of being imported and put into inventory and pulled out of inventory and then exported. What does that look like for you as you're trying to collect that data for merchants?
Yeah, I definitely, starting at applying for privileges, I think a lot of companies think of the now and their urgent need to or desire to get the drawback program going. I think it's very important at the onset to make sure you really understand all of your opportunities. On an earlier slide, Tom, you mentioned that we have the ability to go back 5 years. This is not just a 5-year look back. It is not just a right now, but it is something that you're going to be doing hopefully in the future as well. So you want to make sure that when you kick off your program, you encompass all of your opportunities, whether it's unused merchandise, manufacturing, it's packaging, it's rejected, whatever the case may be. You want to set up your program so that it encompasses all the different provisions, but also the actions, whether you're exporting or you're also destroying. So you have to apply for export and destruction separately in order to get both of those active. So when you apply for privileges, you're telling customs not just the provisions, but the actions that you intend to claim on drawback. And so you want to make sure it's all encompassing of what your company is doing, all that your all of the, your documents will be able to support, and that you are also mindful of what your program will be doing, right? You might not be able to submit something because you're going to be exporting out into the UK and you're going to claim unused merchandise substitution. Today, you have an unused merchandise direct identification program in Canada. Obviously, you're not going to be able to apply for unused merchandise substitution because you don't have an export that qualifies. But so far as you have documentation for, you want to apply. And then when it falls outside of the scope, that proof of concept, that's where the Customs Form 7553 comes into play. In certain cases, right? If you're switching from unused merchandise to rejected, they don't grandfather or extend your privileges. That resets once that new application is submitted. So 7053s at that point will be very critical, and vice versa as well. But speaking generally, right, you're applying for these privileges, which is essentially the type of drawback that you're going to be applying, the action, and then you're going to provide that proof of concept import, inventory, and export of what you intend to claim and how your documentation supports your claim for drawback. Then we move, and that doesn't take long. It depends on how readily available documentation is. It could take a couple of weeks, could take a couple, maybe a month or two, depending on how many different parties need to come together for the documents and how readily available they are. But once that's submitted, that's when we typically move to data collection. Some companies switch it where they want all the data first, then they'll submit the application, submit the claim right after. It takes customs 4 to 6 months on average, and those timelines are beginning to extend closer to 5 to 7, sometimes to 9 months on the applications. So I don't like to wait to submit that application. We'll have time to pull together the data, unfortunately. And so, regardless if it's before or after we pull together the import data, that generally involves ACE, broker data, potential ERP, WMS data as relates to the imports. And on the outbound side, generally ERP, WMS data on the outbound side. There are some companies that use forwarder data or other services, other sources, but generally it can be, as long as it's complete and sufficient in terms of the data and the quality and granularity, use WMS or ERP data on the outbound side. And then depending on the provision, I want to think about drawback in 2 buckets, right? Or 3. There's the import side, there's the export side, and then there's this big black box. That black box is that piping that is governed by regulations on how exports can or should or have to be matched to imports, either directly, indirectly, through bills of material, what have you. Once that data is prepared, the claims are processed through the appropriate heuristics to match up exports back to imports, and calculating the subsequent refund. Those claims can then be generated electronically. It sounds like through ACE. There's nowhere in ACE, if you log into ACE and say, hey, I want to submit my drawback claim, that's not actually how it works, but you have to submit electronically your claim to customs. Hopefully by that point, your privileges are granted. But in the event that they're not, once your privileges are granted, you will be paid automatically within 4 to 6 weeks. When your privileges are granted, there is a letter that is mailed to you. It depends a little bit on your communication channels that you've set up in your ACE portal or in general, but the broker will receive a copy and you will receive an email copy as well of your drawback privileges. Then, right, within 4 to 6 weeks from thereafter, one of the privileges that we're applying for is accelerated payment. And that accelerated payment you need a bond for. But then you get access to a faster timeline on payment. So that 4 to 6 week window. There are still drawback checks. If you have ACH set up, maybe it'll go to you sometimes it won't. It's a whole thing. But definitely once you receive that refund, your first claim will get a desk review. I know this is a big concern for a lot of companies. Tom, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
Yeah, let's talk about that, right?
Sure.
You probably don't want to submit a massive claim at the very first, right? Because you do have that full desk review where, what are you saying? They're going to pull out 5, 6, 7 shipments and say, give me every detail about the shipment here, the import, the inventory, the export, and providing all the documentation to substantiate the claim here.
Yeah. So what customs, when we submit that first claim, we're not trying to be nefarious. This is customs has requested a particular officer or drawback specialist at customs, who, if you do drawback, you've probably had a call from her. She advises to please submit a small claim so they don't have to review all the records. And by practice, the full desk reviews or their mini audit is 7 ITINs, which are transactions within the claim, which may represent up to 7 imports, 7 exports, but depending on which ones they select, it might be, less imports, less exports, depending on how the claim is constructed. But yeah, they're looking for, all right, you said within the application that you had all this documentation. You said this documentation was going to support the claim. You said you qualify for this. And this is really your chance to provide the documentation and demonstrate to customs that you are able to comply with all the obligations and opportunities, or are eligible for the opportunities that drawback will afford you. So they're going to look for 7 imports, right? Do you have the documents? Show me the transfer merchandise. If you brought it to 3PL to next and then you export it out here, they want to see that in certain circumstances. They're going to ask you again about the returns. Returns is a big issue. They know it. They see it. They have a target. They want to keep their money, right? So they're going to ask that question. You want to make sure you have a response for that question. It's not about being nefarious. Hey, I only received 1 unit of return ever within this inventory. Sorry. Do you know which unit it is? Can you identify it? Because it's not negligible. It is all or nothing in a lot of cases. So you want to make sure you are really buttoned up there. But they give you 30 days, which is fairly reasonable, to get 7 imports, 7 exports, to really tell that story. Most drawback providers, I know we do this, will do this for you as the drawback claimant. We'll work with you to pull together the imports, the exports, anything else that is needed, compile that response, and then submit it to U.S. Customs. You have 30 days. So you can request an extension. You don't want to, because you want them fresh. Look at it, close it out, and move on.
And what happens if they reject it? The desk review comes back and they say we have issues.
Yeah. So typically they don't go straight to rejection. They'll be like, hey, I'm missing the connection between the CI and the entry. This doesn't happen very often, but just to keep it simple, I'm missing the connection between the CI and this entry. Can you show me? And then we'll walk through how things connect. So they will work with you. Oftentimes, it depends a little bit on their comfort level with the broker. Like, we have great relationships. We know all the drawback specialists. Many drawback brokers will, and so they're afforded a little bit of that opportunity to have the dialogue. It is not customs obligation that they extend that to everybody. They may just go straight to rejecting it, but they're typically in the process of having those conversations. That being said, they can still reject it. And then there's the process of protests. So you can go through the protest process, the application for further review. Then you can go to, there's also opportunities to go to supervisory drawback specialists. You can go up the chain in operations. You can also discuss with OT drawback to try to eliminate the need to go to a protest, the need for that to be rejected. You really want to resolve prior to them rejecting it. And there are escalation paths to doing it, but ultimately, if it is rejected, there are ways to continue that process, right? Which could include a ruling. It could include going to Office of Regulations and ruling saying, hey, this is my process. This is why I feel it is compliant. And, obviously not like that through an attorney or someone who really with that sort of pedigree, putting that together so that you give yourself a chance to retain those refunds, right? Anybody, and I'm sure I've said this to you as well, Tom, and it's easy to file drawback. It's a little bit harder to keep it.
Yeah.
So rejections are not very common. It is, I will say, now customs has elevated kind of across the board, whether it's drawback, entry. I'm sure a lot of you are seeing more problems now, not problems, but constructive dialogue with customs where there's difference of opinions. And, if the bar used to be here, it's significantly higher now. So it really is important to make sure you really demonstrate that you can comply. Don't leave things up for interpretation. They're not going to interpret. They're not going to infer. You need to explicitly demonstrate. And that's become very important now in particular.
Now, accelerated payments, that's part of the application process, but you see some claimants forego accelerated payments, right? Why would they want to do that?
Yeah. I will say I've only ever seen one, but I know it's out there. Some companies only apply for a one-time waiver and not a waiver of prior notice, waiver of prior notice and not a one-time waiver. So just for context, the one-time waiver is that 5-year look-back period. The waiver of prior notice extends that, continuous export destruction as long as you follow the same proof of concept. That extends that forward. And then the third bit is accelerated payment. I would say almost 100% of the time, if we're looking at 100 applications, but if we're looking at 10,000, maybe 1, 2 to 5 to 10 applications, will include all of them. There's also a drawback compliance program, but to this date, there's no benefit to it. And it's basically doing an audit at the time that you file the application and later. So there's really no benefit. Nobody really does it. So you do the one-time waiver, the waiver of prior notice, and accelerated payment. You almost do them always together. If there is a particular need why you only need to do one or the other, or you cannot get a bond if you tried, maybe accelerated payment doesn't matter, or it doesn't matter to you. But the accelerated payment one in particular, you can decide not to submit a claim with a bond and not take advantage of the privilege. Just like you can get your one-time waiver for the last 5 years and only claim on prospective once they have occurred, or the waiver of prior notice and only claim on the one-time waiver covered transactions. So I would not submit an application unless there was a very specific, exceptional use case for only applying for certain drawback privileges.
And if you don't have accelerated payments, what are you looking at there? 18, 24 months to get it paid out?
Yeah, it depends on liquidation, right? So you have 314 days. They can extend it up to 3 times. Yeah. But what's crazy is, right, we all know the reality of the import community right now, right? You're asking for extended liquidation. Many companies are asking for extended liquidations, whether they'll get them or customers will even acknowledge the email, putting that aside. And then you're probably, depending on what happens, with our arguments today, right, you could be submitting protests. So, the drawback claim's not going to liquidate until all the imports contained within that drawback claim liquidate as well. So yeah, 314 days extended 3 times up to 4 years. But if all those underlying transactions also are not liquidating because of, let's say, a court case, right, in some hypothetical world, you could be looking at a much longer period of time to getting that refund. So there really is not, and bonds are super cheap.
Yeah.
So I don't see a reason why you shouldn't be applying for accelerated payment.
Gotcha. All right, great info. Let's look at some of the requirements here, right? I think one thing you probably see is you may have merchants who are using Flexport as a forwarder, a broker, and a 3PL. So you have a lot of these documentations at your fingertips. But how would you go about getting this? What's the approach to working with merchants to collect this information, the import docs, the inventory docs, and the export?
Yeah. So I'll say, I think it's important to note that a lot of drawback providers do things differently. So what I'll say is there are different schools of thought. Some drawback providers will require you to have physical possession, and in some cases even provide them with physical possession of all imports, all exports, prior to doing a drawback claim. There are other schools of thought that, hey, your broker by regulation is required to hold on to these documents. Make sure that they are holding on to those records. And not only that, but get a copy for yourself. And on the outbound side, right, make sure you have access to all the export documentation, which, there are record keeping obligations there as well. So you need to be, if you look at the 2 times you really need documentation, it's at the time of the application and at the time of the first desk review. Now you'll need documentation in between when you're doing, sanity checks. Did my data come through properly? Does everything look right? Can I get this document right? Doing those testing exercises is important, but customs is going to give you 30 days to get 7 imports and 7 exports. Can you do that? But that doesn't mean that you rely solely on your broker. It doesn't mean you rely solely on your forwarder or your login to FedEx, UPS, DHL, whoever the case may be, for any export documentation. You need to set up a process to make sure that if you're filing a claim for 2023, can I get these export documents? Who has them? Where are they? And get access to that. So I think that's one advantage I think 3PLs have over a lot of other companies, is especially if they're managing the freight. If you're managing the move, you and the companies that you work with have an advantage, because, right, you go on that website 6 months later, your tracking number might be recycled. It might be gone. I can't demonstrate that it was received by my end customer anymore. And then the lift to getting that documentation sometimes requires a fee, right? Or it requires a bit more effort when it comes to those particular couriers.
Yeah, that's a really good point. On the import side, you're likely importing in bulk. On the export side, probably small package shipments, and there are many more of those than there were for that one import of bulk inventory. And the tracking numbers do get recycled. It can be every 12 months, every 18 months, depending on the carrier. So how else do you go about proving that the good had been exported if you don't have that traceability with the tracking number to show that the good was delivered to a foreign address?
Yeah. Well, you at that point, the first step we really do is we know what customs checklist is, right? You're looking at it here. They're looking at the checklist, but then we go back to what do the regulations actually require? Who's the exporter of record? Where did it go? When did it leave? What's the identity of the merchandise? Can you demonstrate that it actually left the commerce of the United States? Date and fact of exportation. So what do I have within my system? My system is a reference point, but it is not a point that customs is going to hold on to. So you're looking now to also third parties, going to your invoice, seeing that FedEx or whoever the case may be invoiced you for this. Maybe you can get into their system and see some of the stuff, but without being able to go through that list and check each one of them off, not documentation, but the burden of proof from a fact-based perspective. If you can't check all of those off, then drawback's not going to be an option. If you can't demonstrate that it was exported definitively, this is a privilege for exporters. You have to be able to prove that you export and retain the documents. So it's something that is a bit of a challenge, especially when you're relying on low-cost third-party providers on pulling that data, years later.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So quickly, we want to cover how do you get to your drawback potential? I think one of the best ways I think you'd probably say is if you do have an ACE account and you can see your imports, then that's a great way to do it. Otherwise, estimating how much you paid in duties and fees coming into the US, what percent of your goods are re-exported, and then 99% of that. And then the other way to work it, of course, is what would be the cost of goods for those exports, and what's your duty rate on your items that were exported, and just to ballpark what it would be. But how do you approach this to get a more accurate estimation up front of the potential?
Yeah. So drawback's interesting because there's a lot of, there's 27 different types or provisions of drawback. Then there's, 6, 7 different accounting methods and how you can match stuff up. Then when there's manufacturing, there's also different bases of claim. And so largely you don't know definitively down to probably 30%. Without actually running the data through, collecting, compiling, and actually processing that through. Because your entry line, your tariff details are a summation in a lot of cases, in most cases, of all the SKUs on a particular entry line. Maybe multiple SKUs on a single CI. All are classified the same way, different varying values, and so that'll all get squished. If you export that same CI out, you could be getting impacted by the lesser of, which we didn't get into in an interest of time. Happy to explain it some other time. So largely what we say to get the impact, method 1, method 2 are great because they get the ball rolling, right? You want to make sure, is it feasible? Do I qualify? What's my refund opportunity from a big picture perspective? Is it worth going through this? And once those two things are done, get that application started and start pulling together the data. Drawback, we're generally going to be within 30% of what we ballpark, unless there are exceptional cases where, you're doing substitution and multi-sourcing really kicks up your potential, or you're doing direct identification and just SKU level matching is very different. So it's more I see this as more of an intent to understand what the opportunity is, if it's a viable opportunity.
Yeah, and I know many providers do have a minimum where it's not worth the effort, right? Because you're paying, you get paid when you recover duties and fees, and you're taking a percent of that. What do you see in the industry as a ballpark minimum?
I will say it varies significantly. I know some brokers don't. They've told me some things that I'll paraphrase, and they're looking for $1 million or more in annual drawback recoveries. Some companies are looking at less. So it really does run. I would say drawback is not worth it if you're not recovering at least $30,000 to $50,000, because it is quite a bit of, and this is my perspective, it is quite a bit of work on it. If you have really good data and really solid documentation down to that part number level, and you're not really doing manufacturing or anything complicated, then that threshold decreases. But if you're going to be relying on all these third parties and documentation is not really there, the data is not to the part and SKU level, that barrier to entry is a little bit higher.
Gotcha. And yeah, we do see that as well there. And what the other question we see is, how much should you be paying if you do have 20 million in drawback annually? You're probably not going to expect to pay 30% to a provider, right?
No, but you definitely should not.
But if you only have 20,000, and if you can find someone to take you, you're probably not expecting to pay single digit either.
No, absolutely not.
Yeah, so there's definitely a range in there of what we see charged in the industry, and it really is based on the amount that's recoverable and the quality of the data. I think it has to be worth it for both parties, but those are really good ballparks on when to consider it. Question came in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was actually going to jump on the second question here.
Yeah.
Because I think when it comes to returns, when they're international returns, I just want to qualify, it's not, if it's a return from a foreign customer, that's not what we're talking about. It's the domestic sale to a domestic customer that is being returned. That is the point of consideration. If it's used outside of North America, it's still being imported and exported within the same conditions. So there are some caveats, some things to be careful of course, when it comes to those transactions. But we're more, from a qualification perspective, more interested in making sure any retail returns from domestic customers are not being reintroduced and commingled within inventory. Sorry, that was the first question.
Yeah, really good. And the other one, do you want to speak to this about if products are imported under the wrong HS code? What do you do about that? Is there any path forward?
So that would not be a drawback in the sense. I think that's on one of the confusing things with drawback and refunds are always used interchangeably. So if the import entry has liquidated and you're still within 180 days from the time that the entry has liquidated, then you could file a protest with notifying customs of the correction that needs to be made to that entry, and then it's on them to review and approve it and pay that out. But that is something that I would definitely highly recommend talking to your broker in. But if it's not liquidated, your broker can easily do a post-summary correction. That is fairly routine. So I would definitely flag that with your broker as soon as possible.
Yeah, and fix it going forward.
Yes.
The quality of the data that does bring up a really good thing, especially in the substitution, making sure your HS codes, your commodity classifications are accurate both on the import and the export, because that's how you are tying this together.
Absolutely.
Okay, I think we're coming up on time. Any parting thoughts?
No, I think as you pointed out in my signature, if you're importing and you're exporting, you should be doing drawback. I appreciate the invite from Passport. It is a privilege to talk to you again, Tom, and the Passport team. And I appreciate, if you have any questions, please reach out to Passport, to Flexport, Tom and I, and we'll be happy to answer them.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Tim. Really appreciate your expertise, and I'll be seeing you soon.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Take care.